I think we can all agree that there are three huge staples to the 90s: Tamagotchis, skateboards, and of course, Space Jam. That's right, Space Jam, or as my gran likes to call it, Bunny Jordan, was an absolute staple in our household growing up in the 90s. I mean, sure, we would interchange it with some of the Disney movies that came out around the same time and some of the Muppets movies as well. Yeah, we had this huge thing for Muppets Treasure Island. But anyway, Space Jam was an absolute must watch in our house, and we've watched it countless times. And so I have a lot of fond memories looking back on the movie. Sure, it's not as good as some of the other movies that came out around that time, but for a kid growing up in the 90s, it had everything you wanted. The only problem is that growing up in the UK and not being too big of a sports fan, even now, Michael Jordan, outside of Space Jam, didn't really know who he was. I mean, sure, I knew he played basketball and he was famous for doing so, but I knew nothing of his achievements outside of that. But for me, Space Jam existed in this kind of weird vacuum of Americana. I never fully understood the context from which it was produced, but I sure do now. About 2 weeks ago, I was looking for something new to watch, and my younger brother tipped me off to this new documentary called The Last Dance. I knew it had something to do with Michael Jordan, but beyond that, didn't really know anything about it, and so I figured, why not? I'll take a punt on it. Yeah, I binged that whole thing as quickly as I could, and as you can imagine, I have a lot to say about it. But before I do, I just want to say thank you for coming back to my channel, and if you haven't subscribed yet, why not give it a go now? It'll make my day if you do. And if you haven't watched The Last Dance before watching this, I highly recommend pausing the video right now, going and watching the series for yourself, and then coming back here to indulge in the discussion. So anyway, let's dive right in. Now, I have to admit, when it comes to documentaries, I've never been too much of a fan of seeing that genre adapted for television. For me, documentaries tend to be a lot more succinct in the medium of film. Films like Life Animated and Free Solo stick out in my mind because they knew exactly what they wanted to say and had a short time in which to do it, so they made sure that each moment during that movie had something valuable to say within the context of the story that it was trying to tell. On the TV side of things, because the producers have more screen time to play around with, you can dive into deeper aspects of the story, but the problem there is that you can also run the risk of diverting too much from the original story you're trying to tell. Making a Murderer is a great example. For me, that first series is still fantastic to watch today, but there were quite a few moments during it where it just felt like it was meandering and not really focusing on trying to get its point across. And so I was a little reluctant, even though it had a huge amount of hype, to see what The Last Dance could do with the format. Well, I'm here to tell you now that my worries were completely off the mark. This is not only one of the best TV documentaries I've ever seen, but one of the best documentaries, period. The show is a masterclass for the potential of the documentary genre, particularly in this case, a popular story that a lot of people are familiar with, the rise of the Chicago Bulls during the mid-90s Michael Jordan era, but not a lot of people understand the backstory behind what led them to that success. And for me, that's where the show really excels. It's incredible to see the members of the Chicago Bulls come together and pull off these incredible feats of sportsmanship to set a precedent of skill in basketball that had never been seen before. But what's really interesting for me is the ability to dive into the interpersonal relationships of each key member of the team, but also dive into the backstory of those figures to understand what motivated them, what drove them to get to the point where they were at the point of the Chicago Bulls' peak. Of course, this won't be the case for everyone, but for someone like me living outside of the States and being too young to fully appreciate the success of the Chicago Bulls during that time, I didn't really understand what was going on, and The Last Dance just absolutely nails it in terms of filling in that context for understanding not just why Michael Jordan was such a figurehead in basketball, but also understanding why Space Jam was such a big deal when it came out. Up until this point, I had never even heard of Scottie Pippen, but having now watched The Last Dance, I understand that he was just as essential to the Chicago Bulls' success as Michael Jordan was. Similarly, Dennis Rodman was just the guy who played basketball with Kim Jong-un. I had no idea of his defensive skill and how that played into the Bulls' strategy. And so it's just amazing that the filmmakers were able to capture all of this raw footage going on around that time. In fact, it makes me wonder why it took so long for this footage to see the light of day now, over 20 years later. And so, if like me, you were a huge fan of Space Jam growing up, but didn't really fully understand the backstory behind it all, then The Last Dance is a fantastic watch, and a must-watch, I would argue. for understanding the full history that went into this incredible moment of sport. And as The Last Dance can attest to, it's a moment in basketball history that really put the NBA on the map. Since finishing this series, I've even picked up a copy of NBA 2K20 just so I could learn the rules of the game. That's how much I enjoyed this series, and that's coming from someone who is not a sports fan by any means. This is a must watch. If you're looking for something new to watch, look no further than The Last Dance. But for those of you who have been watching it, what do you think of it? Do you think that there's a better basketball documentary out there? If so, I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below.